Thank you for joining the June 2026 Broadcom TAM customer webinar. This webinar series is organized by TAMs to connect you with industry experts, ensuring you get the most out of your VMware by Broadcom software. Before we get into the content today, there are a couple of announcements. Our next webinar will be on July 16th, where we will continue our 9.1 series with a practitioner's look at vSphere 9.1. We'll focus on practical use cases and things like performance improvements and cost optimization features you can implement right away. We want this to be an interactive session, so please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. And if we can't get to yours today, please reach out to your TAM for a follow-up. At the end of the session, you will see a quick 2-question survey. Your feedback on the value of this session and your ideas for future topics are very important to us, very helpful to us. So thank you in advance for filling it out. Today's webinar is being recorded. Your TAM can provide you with the link when it becomes available. It will also be available publicly on the VMware by Broadcom TAM Services YouTube channel. With that, let's introduce today's speaker and topic. We're joined by Kyle Gleed from our VCF product marketing division. He's here to take us through the foundation of the VCF journey, the build journey, exploring how VCF 9.1 accelerates initial deployment, scaling, and maintenance. Kyle, thank you so much for being here. I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
All right, great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your schedule to attend. I hope you'll find this session worthwhile and informative. As discussed, I'm going to be focused primarily on deploying VCF 9.1. And so we're going to talk about this component called the VCF Installer. We'll look at how we can use the VCF Installer to do both a new, or what we call a greenfield deployment, as well as to point the VCF Installer to existing infrastructure and do what we call a converge or a brownfield deployment. As I go through the presentation, I do have the Q&A window open. I do ask you to put any questions in the Q&A. Try to avoid putting them in the chat, as the chat can get overwhelming and the questions can get lost. But if you put them in the Q&A, I'll watch for those, and we'll try and answer as many of those as we can as we go through. And so with this, let's go ahead and jump in. We got a lot of content, and we want to make sure we make the best use of our time. So not understanding how many of you have any experience with VCF 9, but in VCF 9.0, we introduced the VCF installer, and with VCF 9.1, the version we just GA'd back on April 20th, I believe, there's some improvements to the VCF installer, and there's a couple of subtle changes. So if you're very familiar with the VCF installer, this first part might seem very familiar, but if you're not, let's just go ahead and talk about this. But essentially, what we've done at Broadcom with VCF 9 is we made it very easy to basically deploy and VCF, the full stack VMware Cloud Foundation. And the component we use to do this is the VCF installer. So the VCF installer, it is a lightweight appliance, meaning it's an OVA file. So you download the OVA file and you deploy it. And it comes with its own UI. And basically, you go in, and the first thing you'll do is you'll set up a depot, you'll download binaries, and then you have this UI that will basically guide you through asking you questions about what you want to deploy, what size you want to deploy, and it will basically generate a JSON file that will then pass in and use automation to deploy the infrastructure. A couple of things about the VCF installer. If you're familiar with older versions of Cloud Foundation going back to the 5.x days and prior, we had something called the Cloud Builder. And you can think of the VCF installer as an evolution of the Cloud Builder. But one of the biggest changes between the old Cloud Builder and the new VCF installer is the size. So where the Cloud Builder, when you download it, it would be right around 30 gig in size. It was quite large, and oftentimes it would take a little bit of time to download. The VCF installers are around 2 gig in size. And the reason why it's so much smaller is because we no longer bundle the binaries with the installer. So when you download the installer, you get the installer. And then the first thing you'll need to do is you'll need to register what we call a software depot. And then once you're connected to a software depot, you download the binaries. And this has a couple of benefits. One of them being is that you always get the latest binaries when you do a deployment. So if you deploy the installer and then 6 months later you deploy another instance of the installer, you'll get those newer binaries because you'll have to re-download those. So you always get the latest binaries. It's very easy to use. The depot, we do have support for both an online and offline. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So if you're a dark side or you're somebody who doesn't connect directly to the internet, don't worry. You can connect and get the binaries still using the VCF download tool. So anyways, that is kind of the VCF installer. Um, in terms of the software depot, as I mentioned, you do have a choice between the online and the offline depot. So here you see an example from the screenshot, and the online depot is by far the simplest. One thing about the depot is in VCF 9.0, we introduced this concept of a token. You'd have to go out and get a token, and this token would basically be an encrypted string that would basically take care of authentication. So you could basically validate who you are to the Broadcom software portal. And after that validation, you'd be able to then download the binaries. And you can provide that token to the VCF installer in order to get that access. With VCF 9.1, we've changed that up a little bit. And instead of a token, you now need an access code. And essentially the difference is once you deploy the VCF installer, you will have an ID associated with it. You'll need to take that ID out to the VCF Business Services Console, and register that instance of the installer, and at which time it will generate an access code. And then you basically use that access code. But you basically go in, then when you click on the configure button, that's where you'll get the ID. You'll go out to the Business Services Console, get that access code, come back, put that access code in there, and then the binaries will become available and you'll be able to download those. That's and the nice thing about the online depot is as new binaries get published or new app patches or updates become available, you immediately see those in the VCF installer. Will see those, detect those, and you'll be able to basically see the metadata and then download those when you're ready. Conversely, if you don't use the online depot, you use the offline depot. Now for the VCF installer, now keep in mind, we're going to talk about a software depot in two contexts. There's the VCF installer. So you're basically getting started with VCF. You're using the VCF installer to deploy a new VCF instance. And then once VCF is stood up, there's also a software depot inside of VCF operations. Very similar, same concept, two different implementations. But one noted difference here is when you talk about the VCF installer, you have two choices. When you get into VCF operations, you're going to see there's actually a third choice. So just keep that in mind that when we talk about software depot, you need to remember the context here. Are we talking installer? Are we talking ops? Same thing, but slightly different context. But anyways, when you go into the installer, you do have the option to set up an offline depot. Now, the offline depot is the word implies is for those environments that are not connected to the internet. And so for these environments, what you do is you use something called the VCF download tool to basically go in, and it's a command line tool. You'll download and deploy, and then you can run it and take care of the registration process to get your access code, your ID, take that out to Business Services Console, get your access code, and then come in and you can download those binaries. And then in addition, what you'll do is you'll host an offline, a local web server, and then you can basically use the VCF download tool to copy the binaries to that web server in a directory structure that matches what the VCF installer expects, and get your binaries that way. Here you can see I've actually got the offline depot in this example, and I've set it up on a depot, a web server, and I have set up SSL authentication as well. So that is the depot. So keep in mind, just kind of wrapping up here. When you install, you're going to use the VCF installer, and the first step, it no longer includes the binary. So the first thing you're going to need to do is set up a software depot. If you're a connected site, you have firewall ports open, the online depot is by far the easiest. Otherwise, you'll need to set up an offline depot, which is not that involved, but is some extra steps and does use the VCF download tool. Okay. And here's an example of the online depot and that download, that ID I mentioned. So here's the ID. So you basically copy this ID, you go out to the Business Services Console where you'll then register it, and it will give you an activation code, and you paste that in here. And it's that easy, and you just click authenticate. And then once you're authenticated, it will stay authenticated, and you'll be able to see the binaries and everything works. And note here, we do have the ability to work through a proxy server as well. And then the offline depot here again has that requirement that you set up a local web server. And here I just you can do this with 9.0. We didn't have support for HTTP. We required HTTPS, which required authentication. With 9.1, we've added support for HTTP as well if you want to do that way. But here you basically set that web server, you set up your SSL authentication, and then you basically use the VCF download tool to basically download the binaries, copy them into the environment using whatever method you have for that, and then make them available. Okay, so once you have stood up the VCF installer, now one other thing I'll mention about the VCF installer, and this is important because a lot of times when I'm doing these presentations, and some of you may have actually went out to the Broadcom software portal and started searching for VCF installer, and you will find that there is no binary that's named VCF installer when you go out to the Broadcom software portal. That's because the VCF installer is actually part of the SDDC manager. So the SDDC Manager appliance, it's appliance that gets deployed as part of Cloud Foundation. We've added the VCF installer into that appliance, so it's the same OVA. And when you deploy that OVA, by default, it runs in installer mode. And then there is some logic that will switch it over to SDDC Manager mode in certain situations. So if you're looking for the VCF installer, you'll want to download the SDDC Manager appliance. Okay, so I'll just kind of remind you of that because I do usually get some follow-up with people saying, hey, I'm looking for that installer you were talking about. I can't find it. And then I had to point out that it's actually got a different name in the VCF software portal. Okay, so let me do a quick check of the questions here. Question about DNS RFC and maybe mixed case. I'm not sure. I don't have an answer for that one. Is a software depot still bound to a personal account, or would it be possible to use a service account instead? So the software depot is tied. It's not really the software depot. It's the VCF Business Services Console. You do have to authenticate, log into that, and you'll need to do that to generate that access code. And there, within your organization, there is somebody who has kind of oversees that, and there is the ability for them to create sub-admin accounts as well. So there is an account associated with the VCF Business Services Console. You can delegate, and you can have different people in the organization responsible for different parts of that. But that's so that's kind of tied to that. But there's no, in terms of the software depot, that we use the access code, and that access code, once generated, is tied to that instance of the VCF installer. So if you have multiple organizations, each running their own version of the VCF installer, each VCF installer will have a unique ID. You would have to go out, register, and get its own access code. So a question about Cisco providing drivers for 9.1, but yet cannot install 9.1 due to the lack of drivers. I'm not really sure what that question is about, but I will point out that as 9.1 is just recently released in the last 3 months or so, 2-3 months, just keep in mind that it does take some time for some of our partners and some of the other vendors to finish their qualification and to follow on with support for 9.1. So if you're looking to upgrade and you have things like Zerto or Veeam or Cisco or other vendors, just make sure you do go out and check with them and on their qualification and validation, and if they are ready for VCF 9.1, just to make sure that those are tested and validated and you have the right versions before you jump into that upgrade. Okay, so thanks for those questions, and we'll go ahead and jump back in to the presentation. So in terms of the UI, so I mentioned when you do the installer, it's very easy. We have this intuitive UI that basically will walk you through gathering all the inputs. Here you see an example where it's basically going to walk through 9 steps to basically prompt you for the information for each of these components. What host names, what IPs, what subnets, what masks, things like that. How many distributed switches, what VLANs, all that information. And you can go through and do that. And it's very, very easy, very straightforward. Now, some of you may have environments where you're going to be deploying a lot of VCF in terms of maybe you're going to be repeating deployments. Like I know some people who do training and education, they'll be doing this quite often. And when you start doing this multiple times, walking through this wizard can become a bit tedious. So we do have the ability when you go through to basically take the inputs and save them as a JSON template. So here's an example where we've taken the inputs and saved them as a JSON template. And then as you go forward on subsequent deployments, you can just basically edit the JSON template, and you can use automation to customize this and use scripts and stuff. And then you import that into the VCF installer, and it will avoid having to go in and retype all the values. And that has a couple of benefits, especially if you're doing, like I say, multiple deployments, but it also helps to reduce the risk of typos and transposing numbers when you do the deployment. So basically, and also the other thing about the JSON, you'll often hear us referred to, you'll ask about, hey, can I set up a certain type of distributed switch configuration? And they'll say, well, that's not in the UI, but you can do it using the API. Well, what do they mean when they say you can do it using the API? Well, they mean you can basically come in and use a JSON file, and you can go in and update those settings within the JSON file. So when we refer to JSON file, that's kind of the API approach. And so in addition to be able to simplify future deployments, this is also a way to do custom deployments, is using this JSON file as well. Okay. In addition, with VCF 9.1, one of the things we've done with the VCF installer is we've put in some work to try and make it easier to help you help customers understand the resource requirements when deploying Cloud Foundation. So here you'll see when we go in after we've provided the summary of the type of topology you want to deploy in terms of the form factor, the size, whether we do simple or HA, it will basically come back and the type of storage you're using, and we'll come back and say, okay, based on the inputs you provided, here's the minimum number of hosts that are needed for this. And in this example, 4, a number of VLANs that are needed based on your network configuration, whether you can put management traffic on the same network as your ops and your ESX management as your VCF management, or whether you can have separate. That will determine the number of VLANs, and then also give you guidance in terms of fully qualified domain names and IP address ranges that will be required. And so this can kind of help with some of the early planning. This is very early in the installer, so you can actually run the installer, go through, get this information, and then validate that you have everything you need. Or if you need to go back and add some more fully qualified domain names or get some more VLANs, you can basically save that and go back, take care of those, and come back into the installer and proceed. But basically, this guidance in terms of integrated planning and preparation built into the installer to help with instilling confidence and help make sure you have enough capacity. So in addition to be able to do new greenfield deployments, as I mentioned, you can do, well, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. So when you deploy Cloud Foundation, there's a couple of new concepts that you need to be very familiar with. There's this concept of a VCF fleet and a concept of a VCF instance. In addition, we have this concept of a workload domain. So these are 3 concepts that you want to be very familiar with. They're basically the building blocks of the private cloud. And when you come in the installer, one of the first questions it's going to ask, as we see it here, is, are you deploying a new fleet, deploying a new instance? And then this deploy deferred components. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's kind of a customized deployment. But essentially, what does it mean to deploy a new fleet versus deploy a new VCF instance? Okay, so essentially, if you are starting from scratch, you have a vSphere environment, you don't currently have VCF, and you are going to basically deploy your first VCF instance, you'll start by deploying a new VCF fleet. And essentially what this means is, as part of this new VCF instance, it's going to deploy an instance of VCF operations. VCF operations is a mandatory component. It's got a new role within VCF. It's where we do our licensing. It's also where we do all the lifecycle. It's where we set up our software depot. And so you need to have that instance of VCF operations. So if you don't have one, it will deploy one. If you do have one, you can basically bring that existing VCF operations or ARIA operations into the new environment. But basically, when you create a new fleet, it's basically going to instantiate that new VCF operations instance. If you already have an instance of VCF operations up and running, and you're going to add an additional VCF instance, you don't need to have another VCF operations. So hence, you can add a new VCF instance to that existing fleet. So I got some slides coming up. We'll go through this in a little bit more detail with some graphics, but essentially you want to make sure you understand these concepts of the fleet and the instance, and the significance of deploying a new fleet versus deploying a new instance. The installed deferred components, I mentioned I'd get back to that. So essentially what this is you do have the option to deploy things like operations, automation, ops for networks in different configurations with different network settings. And some customers like to deploy them on software-defined networks or virtual networks, or what we formerly used to call NSX segments. But the VCF installer, it only supports deploying them on VLAN. So if you want to deploy them on NSX segments, you can basically go in and do the install, deferring the ops and auto and deployments, and then you can go and set up your networking, and then come back in, use the VCF installer, and choose the deploy defer components to then go in and deploy those components that were skipped in the first round, so you can get them. So that's kind of a customized deployment. So let me go see. Let me check a quick question. If you have an old VCF ops already, but you have no other VCF. Okay, so we're going to talk about this concept of converging existing infrastructure, and we're actually going to talk about how to upgrade and what those upgrade paths to VCF 9.1 look like for, say, an existing vSphere customer or an existing VCF 5.2 customer. And essentially, if you have an existing instance of ARIA operations, 8.18 or higher, or you have an existing instance of I'm using the word ARIA operations to signify the older version of VCF operations. It's just a name change. But if you have the older version, the way you would create your VCF fleet is you would go in and you would use a pack file to first upgrade that to version 9.1, and then use the VCF installer to import that or converge that in. So you can use your existing ARIA instance or your existing VCF operations instance when you're building a new fleet. And the way you do that is you have to get it up to the required version, which is a manual upgrade done outside of the installer. And then once you have it up running at that version, you can then converge it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. All right, so looking at okay, we talked about the deferred components, and we talked about how we can go in and this is just kind of a repeat of what I already mentioned, but here you'll see I selected the deferred components, and we see here highlighted in yellow. It's basically saying that, hey, you've gone through, you've done your install, but you opted to defer deploying ops and auto and some of these other components. So now you can go in and select this option to deploy those. And so this is really for custom or advanced deployments. So if you are a customer who runs ops or auto, and you want to have those on virtual networks as opposed to on VLAN backed networks, this is how you would achieve that. Okay. Now, in terms of existing components, so when you do the VCF installer, of course, we do greenfield deployments, meaning we can start from scratch and just have ESXi host and deploy everything. We'll deploy the vCenter servers, we'll deploy the NSX managers, we'll prep the host for NSX, we'll go in, deploy operations, we'll go in, deploy the SDDC manager, we deploy this new thing called the VCF management services that we're going to talk about, and we'll do it all from scratch, fully automated, end to end. And that's great for a new deployment when I have new hardware and I'm part of a hardware refresh, and that's good. But what about when I have existing infrastructure? I don't want to start from scratch. I don't want to, I don't have new hardware. I have to basically take an existing vSphere environment, and I want to basically converge that into a VCF instance or a VCF fleet. How do I do that? Well, when you use the VCF installer, it will ask you, hey, do you have any existing components? So here you can see I have an existing VCF operations 9.1 instance. I have an existing vCenter instance, and that vCenter instance may or may not be registered with NSX. So I can bring those existing components in. The VCF installer will ask you what those existing components are. You'll provide that value, and then when the installer goes through and does it, it will know because you have an existing component, rather than go out and, like, for example, deploy a new vCenter server. It's just going to connect to the existing vCenter, do some validations, and bring that in, and that will become your vCenter for your VCF instance, for example. So it makes it very easy to basically, the focus here was primarily on meeting customers where they are. Today, particularly with the challenges around memory and with AI, it can be very hard to get new hardware, and so we're having to make more make do with the existing hardware we have, and as such, it's very important that we be able to move to VCF 9.1 with our existing infrastructure, as opposed to have the convenience of being able to start over with a greenfield deployment. That's not always practical. Okay. Passwords. So we're getting close to the end of the VCF installer section here. One note about passwords. When you go through the VCF installer, one thing that will stand out is that at no point do we ask for passwords. So an effort to help make the VCF installer easier to use and to require less typing and less inputs, they made the decision to basically auto-generate passwords as part of the deployment. So as you go through and you basically say, I need a vCenter server, I need a new instance of VCF operations, a new instance of a cloud proxy, a new instance of automation, you basically tell it all the components you need. At no point do you provide a password. And then what will happen is the VCF installer will auto-generate secure passwords for each of those components. And then once you've done that, when you're done, you'll see here in the gray area, there's a review password. So when you kick off the install, it will generate those passwords, and then you can go in and access those passwords. And this is an example of what that looks like. You can save them in JSON format or a comma separated values format as well. Now, one note about the passwords, as I mentioned, when you use the VCF installer and you're going to use the UI, the passwords are auto-generated. Now, I have a lot of customers who come back and say, you know what, I don't want auto-generated passwords. I want to choose the passwords. How do I do that? Well, remember when I talked about how you can save the configuration as a JSON and go in and customize it? You can go into the JSON and add your own passwords in the JSON file. So you can basically go through the wizard, save the JSON, go into the JSON and add the passwords, setting them to a value that you want, and that's not auto-generated, and then import that into the installer and then proceed with the deployment. So there is a workaround, and again, we use the JSON to accomplish that. So that's that last bullet here. Okay, so that's the VCF installer. Let me check the questions. There's a question about the VRSLCM, that is the vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager. Supported lifecycle of the orchestrators, how many standalone VROs with Fleet Manager? Or I don't know if VROs is orchestrators or ops. But essentially, the one note about the vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager. So back in the ARIA days, or back in the 8.18 or 8.x days of the ARIA Suite, the vRealize Suite, Suite Lifecycle Manager, the VRSLCM, and that took on the role of kind of automating the deployment, the patching of the manager components, things like operations, ops for networks, logs, automation. And that component, when we went to VCF 9.0, became the fleet manager. So it still existed in 9.0. It became the fleet manager. There was still a VM that would be running, but we removed the UI and no longer had its own separate UI, and the UI moved into operations. Okay, with 9.1, the fleet manager has now been moved into what we call the VCF management services. It's now a service running inside of the VCF services runtime. This is something we haven't talked about yet. We're going to talk about it coming up, and we're going to see hopefully an example of what this looks like. But keep in mind that that does go away with 9.1 in the sense that you no longer, if you have a vRealize Suite Lifecycle Manager, that appliance will get left behind as you upgrade, and that functionality moves into this new VCF management services. So we still have the capabilities, we still have the functionality. It's just we no longer have a separate dedicated appliance, as it's now running as a containerized service on top of a Kubernetes cluster that we call the VCF management services. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, hopefully when we get up to the next section. The question, did the auto-generate password thing change from 9.0? Yes. In 9.0, you still have the ability to specify your own passwords in the UI. At 9.1, we removed that option. So in 9.0, when you deploy 9.0, it would ask you, do you want to use auto-generated passwords, yes or no? If you say no, then it would basically give you a password field and you'd provide those passwords. And 9.1, we took that out and we just auto-generate. And the only way to work around that is with that JSON. So thanks for that question. There's a question about the minimum number of hosts. The minimum number of hosts is going to vary depending on your type of storage. If you're using vSAN, then the minimum number of hosts is going to be 3. The recommended number is 4 because if you have 3, that will work. But what happens the minute you need to put a host into maintenance mode? You're automatically in a degraded state. So that's why we always recommend 4. If you're using NFS or fiber channel, and particularly for some of these smaller deployments that are running at remote locations, you can use 2 nodes. So 2 nodes is technically the minimum required to deploy Cloud Foundation. The catch there is in order to do 2 node, it has to be either fiber channel or NFS. And there's a question about, is there a way to set a policy on the auto-generated passwords? So the auto-generated passwords, that's a good question. I'm not aware of any way. I've not seen any way to set the policy. They are complex passwords. I think they might be 15 characters. And, they are default on the complex side. I don't know if there's files we can go into on the VCF installer to customize in order to maybe make it more restrictive or less restrictive. That's something I'd have to follow up on and see. So I apologize. I don't know the answer to that one. All right, so let's go ahead. Questions are starting to come in here, which is good. Let me kind of shift over and we're going to talk about upgrade paths and kind of continue on with our VCF installer, but talk a little bit about upgrades. But let's make sure we get at to as many questions as we can. It says 2 nodes does not work if it fails the workflow and will not deploy. Okay, so one thing kind of caveat here on the 2 nodes. So I mentioned that depending on your deployment in NFS and storage, the other factor that I failed to mention is that depending on when you deploy, there's a simple model and there's a high availability model. And also, depending on how you size out your VCF management services, some of these components require a minimum of 3 VMs, and you can have, essentially 2 is the minimum required, but if you deploy additional components, some of those components may introduce a requirement for a 3rd node because they may have, like, for example, if you do high availability mode and I need to have 3 NSX managers, then I need 3 ESX hosts, 1 for each of those NSX managers. So it would work for a simple deployment, but it wouldn't work for a high availability deployment type thing. Or if I go in and deploy, anyways, that's kind of the other thing to keep in mind there. So basically, if you're looking at, I guess I just kind of back up here and say, if you're looking at the minimum number of nodes because you're looking at running a lab environment, that's one use case. But if you're looking at the minimum number of nodes because you're looking to run VCF at a remote location that doesn't need a lot of capacity, depending on what you're looking for, your use case, it may be better just to run a workload domain at that remote location as opposed to try and deploy a full VCF instance in order to meet that minimum requirement. If you're looking to do a lab, then there are some things you can do to kind of work around some of these challenges. But those are the things to consider is your deployment model, whether you're doing simple or high availability, your storage type, all those factor in and will influence on the minimum number of nodes required. And remember, the VCF installer, when you go through that first section and do the planning phase, it will come back and give you a minimum number of hosts based on your requirements. So you can actually go into the VCF installer, play with the numbers, and see what it comes back in terms of recommendations and requirements. And okay, so let's go ahead now. And looks like we got through those questions. Thanks. Lots of good questions, lots of good interaction like that. So let's go ahead now. We've talked about the VCF installer, and we've kind of did a high-level overview. But now let's take a step back and let's talk about, okay, if I'm an existing vSphere environment and I want to upgrade to Cloud Foundation 9.1. So what does that look like in terms of what is my upgrade pathway? And also, what about a VCF customer who's running VCF 5.2 or maybe a VCF 9.0 customer? So we have all these different situations that customers may find themselves in. What is that experience to go from where they're at to get to VCF 9.1? What does that experience look like? And we're going to take a few minutes and talk about that. And depending on how quickly I can get through this, I hope to be able to jump into a quick demo and show you what this will look like from an actual product standpoint. Okay, so at a high level, there's 2 things that you'll want to keep in mind when looking to upgrade to 9.1. So first of all, there's 2 parts to the upgrade. So one is you need to complete your VCF fleet, and then the other is you need to upgrade your components. So typically when we think of an upgrade, we think of upgrading the components. upgrade vCenter to 9.1, upgrade ESX to 9.1, upgrade Ops to 9.1. That's definitely part of the upgrade. But when you look at VCF, particularly VCF 9.1, there's this concept of the fleet that I mentioned, and you'll need to make sure you have your fleet. And so if you're missing any of those fleet components, like vRealize operations or the license server or the VCF-MS, you'll need to basically add those components as part of the upgrade. That's what I mean by completing your fleet and updating. So typically, there's these two parts, and so you'll typically approach this from a two-phased approach. You'll go in and you'll use the VCF installer, and you'll complete the fleet. And then you go into operations and you use operations LCM to then upgrade the existing components. So it's usually a two-phased or two-pronged approach. But keep that in mind. It's not just about upgrading the individual components. It's about adding any missing components in order to complete that VCF fleet or that VCF instance, depending on what you're doing. The other thing is there's not a one size fits all. There's not a single path. The path is going to vary depending on your starting state. So for example, if you're a vSphere, then you're going to have a different path to VCF 9.1 than say if you're VCF 5.2 or VCF 9.1. If you're vSphere without NSX, you're going to have a different experience than if you're vSphere with NSX. If you're vSphere with ARIA operations, you're going to have a different experience than if you're vSphere without ARIA operations. And we're going to go through and make sense of this as we go through. But the point is that don't look and see what the other guy did and say, I'm just going to follow that, because his path may be different because his starting state was different. You want to make sure your starting state matches the starting state of the reference, and you follow that and take into account any changes. And then the other thing is when you do the upgrade, it's going to be a mix of both manual things. You're going to manually upgrade vCenter, manually upgrade ops in some cases. You can use the VCF installer to basically converge, and then you can use VCF operations to the upgrade. So there's multiple things at play here, and there's you'll use each of these, and again, depending on that path that you settle on. Okay, so I mentioned before this idea of the workload domain, the VCF instance, the VCF fleet, and I mentioned that when you upgrade, one of the first things you'll need to do is understand where you're at, because phase one is to complete your fleet. Okay, so what do I mean? Well, let's go back and revisit these concepts of workload domains, instances, and fleets. So what is a workload domain? So a workload domain is essentially an allocation of your private cloud infrastructure. Think of a workload domain as a vCenter with the associated set of clusters behind that vCenter. So each workload domain is going to have a dedicated vCenter, and behind that vCenter, you can have one or more vSphere clusters. And the way we allocate capacity in the private cloud is by creating workload domains. And then once you have a workload domain, you have a vCenter server, you can go in and you can add clusters, expand clusters, delete clusters, and you basically can scale by scaling up that workload domain. So that's kind of the concept of the workload domain. And that's something that we've had in VCF going all the way back to the early days of VCF. And so many of you may be familiar with this idea of the workload domain. Now, the VCF instance is essentially a collection of workload domains within a specific location. So if I go into my data center and I take all my workload domains associated with my data center, that would become my VCF instance. Now, there's flexibility here in how I design this. I could have a VCF instance that's spans availability zones and with stretch clustering. I could have a VCF instance within a region. I could have a VCF instance that spans across regions, just depending on your topology. So keep in mind, there is a lot of flexibility here, but in general, in a general context, we take all the workload domains within a specific location, a specific region, and that's going to become our VCF instance. The significance of the VCF instance is that one of those domains, the first domain, is going to have a special role. We're going to call that the VCF management domain. And that's the domain where we're going to run additional services like the SDC manager and the VCF management services. And so you'll have, within a VCF instance, you'll have one management domain with those services. And then the other workload domains will obviously just be that vCenter server with NSX and scale out that way. Now, that's the VCF instance. Now, the VCF fleet, again, as I mentioned, the VCF fleet introduces an instance of ARIA VCF operations. Now, we have VCF automation here as well. So VCF automation is kind of the consumption layer. Operations is the operations layer. From a VCF perspective, ideally in a private cloud, you'd have both. VCF operations is there to monitor the health and performance, to do the lifecycle management, capacity planning, costing, things like that. And then VCF automation is how we go in and create our templates and will allow self-service consumption of them. Now, technically, VCF automation can be deployed as later, as as a day two operation. So it's not technically required to deploy the VCF fleet, but we do show it in our graphs because of its role. And so basically, what you do is you'll take VCF instances and combine them under a common instance of operations and automation that becomes your VCF fleet. So those are the constructs here. So if I'm running a vSphere environment and I say, well, I want to upgrade to VCF 9.1, well, I'm going to have to look at that environment and say, okay, well, I'm going to have to create a VCF instance, which is going to create that management domain and add some additional components. And then if I don't have an existing instance of operations, I'm going to have to deploy that to create my fleet. So you can kind of see how it's very important to have a good understanding of these concepts. And then with these concepts, this is how we build and scale out our private cloud. So a VCF fleet can span across regions. It can include high availability, disaster recovery, replication. And then within a region, we can have VCF instances that can span across availability zones. And within these VCF instances, we can have workload domains with multiple clusters behind them. And you start to see how you can scale this to be quite large. Okay. So now in terms of the components, now when I say required, this does not mean that you have to run them. This means that if you want to have a VCF 9.1 private cloud, these are the components that will be deployed, most likely. And there are a few exceptions to this. So I've got to think of a better word than required for this slide. But essentially, I'm just kind of showing here, the green is what you have, the green, blue is what you have. And then as you move from step to step, you'll see you get more and more blue. So if I go from vSphere 8 to VCF 5.2, I would add the SDDC manager and the NSX manager. So you'll see, those would become required components under VCF 5.2. When I go to 9, you'll see that I get a lot more components, automation, operations, the operations proxy, the SDDC manager, the fleet manager. And then we go to 9.1, as I mentioned, that fleet manager goes away. And then you get additional components as well. But this is kind of give you the idea of the scope of when you're looking at your fleet and you're designing your fleet, what are the components that I need to account for? And again, this is not foolproof. Like, for example, automation is not required. Logs is, I got logs optional. Maybe I should just change that to optional there. But you'll notice down here, there's a couple of new components, the VCF management services and the license server. And those, you will need to set those up as part of your new VCF instance, VCF fleet as well. Okay, so now in terms of making this transition from where you're at to VCF 9.1, there are a couple of deprecated features. Now, this is not new with 9.1. This was first announced in 9.0 timeframe, but there are a couple of things that you'll need to be aware of because these are things you'll have to take care of before you start that path to 9.1. And so one is the vSphere Lifecycle Manager baselines, or what we formerly referred to as VUM. So with 9.1, we have officially deprecated VUM. So you do now have to use the vSphere Lifecycle images, or VLCM images. Okay, and essentially this is just the new method for basically creating images and managing ESX updates. We find that a lot of customers may still be running the older VUM approach, and you'll need to transition from VLCM baselines or VUM to VLCM images prior to doing your upgrade. And this is in the documentation, the steps to do this. But anyways, just want to be aware of it. When we do the validation and the checks, we will check for this. And if we detect that you are running VUM, you will get notified, hey, you need to fix this before you can upgrade to VCF 9.1. But anyways, that's one deprecated feature. And then the other is the enhanced link mode. So enhanced link mode, if you're not familiar with this, essentially the enhanced link mode is a vCenter feature where you could basically add multiple vCenters to the same vCenter SSO domain. And with this same method of authentication, it would do a few things for you. The most common feature that people liked was it give you a single pane of glass where I could log into one vCenter and I could see all the vCenters in my inventory and I could browse their inventory all from the single vSphere client. So that was part of enhanced link mode. It also did some other things in the background as well, but that feature is also deprecated in 9.0. So if you are using enhanced link mode in your 8.x environment, vSphere 8.x environment, you will need to basically take that vCenter out of that enhanced link mode ring prior to converging it or moving it into VCF. And the steps here are going to vary depending if you're a vSphere environment, a VCF environment. And again, this is in the documentation, but just keep that in mind. Now, if you are somebody who uses enhanced link mode, and you really like that single pane of glass feature, you may be asking yourself, well, I don't want that to go away. I like that. I want to keep that. Well, but rest assured, the VCF enhanced link mode functionality, particularly around that single pane of glass, is replaced by a new feature inside VCF operations called vCenter linking. So you can go into VCF operations and set up vCenter linking. And if you set up your VCF SSO, not to be confused with vCenter SSO, but you can basically set up VCF SSO together with your role-based access control and then set up your vCenter linking. And you can basically get the same functionality from VCF operations in 9.0 and 9.1. So just keep that in mind. Those are two deprecated features, and you'll need to address those. Now, in terms of, let me do a quick time check. Okay, it looks like we're doing pretty good.
Yeah,
Let's go
I
ahead
think we're
and,
good.
all right, thanks. Let's go ahead and look at an example of somebody who's running vSphere 8.x, and they want to go to VCF 9.1. So what would this experience look like? Okay. So the first thing you have to ask, remember I stressed, emphasized earlier that the upgrade path is going to vary depending on the components that are installed. So the first thing you'll need to do is ask yourself, is this vCenter registered with NSX or is it not registered with NSX? And that may seem like a silly question. What does NSX have to do with upgrading to 9.1? But it does influence the upgrade path because it determines what version the vCenter needs to be when you do the upgrade. So for example, if vCenter is not registered with NSX, then you will need to manually upgrade your vCenter server to version 9.1. Okay, now I got vSphere here. So you could do both the vCenter server and the ESX cluster and put them both to 9.1 and then use the VCF installer to converge. But technically, the only requirement is you upgrade the vCenter server, and then you can use VCF operations lifecycle management to then upgrade ESX later on. But essentially, the key here is if you don't have NSX, you will need to do that manual upgrade to get vCenter up to 9.1. Okay. But now, how does that different if you are registered with NSX? So if my vCenter is registered with NSX, then you keep vCenter at 8.0 update 3, and you upgrade your vSphere is 8.0 update 3, and you keep NSX at 4.2, and then you'll converge that 8.0 environment using the VCF installer. So here you'll do the manual upgrade of vCenter. Here you do not. You just need to make sure these patches. And then after you've converged, after you've brought this environment in and created your VCF instance, you can then use VCF operations lifecycle manager to upgrade. Okay. Now, one thing here on this slide, I do have or later. You'll notice this says or later, but keep in mind that we do have a situation where, like, for example, 803 update 3, I think J will break. So there's this situation where any patches that were released, any 8.0 updates that were released after VCF 9.1 release, it won't let you do that. So I need to update my slide to be more specific, but do check the documentation and check your versions to make sure you're running a supported version of vCenter, ESX, and NSX prior to doing any type of an upgrade. Yeah. So yeah, the comment is it's called back in time. Basically, there's a check that says, hey, if you're going to upgrade to a newer version, if you have a patch level that's newer than the upgrade version, we're not going to let you go back in time type thing. And there's a KB article that came out on that. So just be careful with this or later. So just check the documentation. I'll probably need to take that or later off and put a little note down here to clarify that. Okay. Now, that is NSX, but now what about VCF operations or ARIA operations? So I'm a vSphere 8.x environment, and what if I am running ARIA operations? So ARIA operations is already in the environment. Well, then I will use the pack file that's available from the Broadcom software portal to upgrade ARIA operations to VCF operations 9.1. And after I do this, if I don't already have an ops proxy deployed, I will need to deploy and configure an ops proxy. So the ops proxies, they help with scaling out the operations, and you basically set up a proxy who collects metrics and then forwards that up to operations. Those were largely optional prior to 9, but with 9, those are now required components. So if you don't have one deployed, you will need to deploy one. But again, if you have the ARIA suite, then you will need to do a manual upgrade and possibly manually deploy the ops proxy to get you into a state where you're ready to converge. Now, if you don't have it, then it's easier because then the VCF installer is just going to deploy a new instance of operations with the proxy and it will be deployed as part of the convergence. Okay. We already mentioned that the ARIA Suite lifecycle is not upgraded to 9.1, so the ARIA Suite lifecycle will continue to run and it will stay running. But as you upgrade ops and as you upgrade auto and as you pull those features in, they will be deregistered from the ARIA Suite lifecycle. And the ARIA Suite lifecycle will still be around. You can still use it to manage some of the older components like logs or VIDM or things like that. And then at such time as you've moved off of those, you can then shut it down and remove it. But just keep in mind that you don't need to worry about upgrading the ARIA Suite lifecycle. Okay. So in terms of when you do so we've talked about the requirements. Okay, do I have NSX? Do I have ops? How it changes my path and how it's going to affect the whether I do manual upgrades or whether I don't do manual upgrades and what versions I upgrade to. That's all important because you're going to need to factor that in. Now, once you've got that all factored in, then you're going to use the VCF installer and you're going to do use the VCF installer to do what we call a converge. And when we converge, you'll see here, we get to that existing components. And this is where we select that we have the existing components. So again, if I don't have NSX, I will need to have vCenter running at 9.1. If I do have NSX, then it'll be running 8.0, 8.x with NSX 4.2. And then I'll go in and select those, and I'll basically converge the environment. And then remember that slide that had the green and the blue, and it had optional and required and stuff. And I talked about how you need to complete your fleet. Well, the VCF installer will kind of look at your environment and determine what you have, what you are missing, and it will basically deploy any missing components in order to complete that VCF fleet. And any new components that get deployed will be deployed as version 9.1. And then once you're done with the VCF installer and you have converged your existing environment, you now have your VCF fleet up and running. Now you'll be running with those existing versions. And so now you shift gears over to the VCF operations where you use Lifecycle Management to then go in and do the necessary patching of those other components to get them up to 9.1. Okay. So that's a lot. And so I kind of have a little bit of repetition here because since we're going through so much, I wanted to make sure that we kind of cover it and with enough repetition that it'll kind of stick. So again, just kind of highlight here, there's really two common paths you're going to want to consider. There's going to be a vSphere with ops and vSphere without ops. Now you may or may not have NSX in the vSphere environment. But essentially you're going to be looking at vSphere without ops and vSphere with ops. And so your upgrade method is going to involve some manual updating and upgrades using the VCF installer together with VCF operations, just as we've gone through. And then these are those notes down here about some of the things left behind. So let's look at it in a little bit more detail. So here is an example where I have vSphere without ops. So here I'm going to start my upgrade path by verifying my perspective, and then I'm going to upgrade my vCenter. Now remember, I'm going to upgrade my vCenter, but the version that I upgrade my vCenter to is going to vary depending on whether or not I have NSX deployed or not. If I don't have NSX, I'm going to upgrade to version 9.1. So I'm going to download the vCenter binary. I'm going to go in, I'm going to do the upgrade it, get it to 9.1. If I do have NSX, then I'm going to upgrade my vSphere to 8.0 update to 3. Now, this step number 3 here is just a reminder that when you do upgrade vCenter, that as part of vSphere, there is a vSAN disk version. There's also a VDS switch version that is also tracked, and you'll need to update those as well. So it's kind of just a reminder to do those. Those are metadata updates. Those happen really quick. And then once you've done that, this is the manual operation. Then you're going to go in and you're going to deploy the VCF installer. Now, remember, when you go out to the Broadcom software portal and you're searching for VCF installer, you're not going to find an appliance called VCF installer. What you're going to find is an appliance called the SDDC manager. You're going to download the SDDC manager, and when you deploy it, by default, it's going to run in installer mode. And the first thing you're going to do is log into the VCF installer and set up your software depot and download your VCF 9.1 binaries. Okay. Those are the manual steps. And then once you're done, you're going to hand off to the VCF installer. You're going to log into the VCF installer, walk through that wizard-driven UI, and it's going to go through, converge that vCenter. It will basically deploy NSX if it's not already deployed. If it is already deployed, it will converge NSX. It will then deploy the SDC manager, and it's going to deploy this new component called the VCF management services. And because we don't have operations, it's going to deploy operations and the operations proxy. Okay, and then once we're done there, we now have our VCF fleet up and running. The only catch here is everything is 9.1 except for ESX. So we'll go and use operations to upgrade ESX. And then once we have completed our upgrade, we will need to relicense our environment for 9.1. So in assuming this was vSphere 8.x, we were using license keys. As we did the upgrade, everything switched over to evaluation mode. So now we go into operations, register our license server, get our license file, and relicense. At step 8, we're largely done with the upgrade. Now we can move on to those day-in activities where we can import and deploy things like, we can import automation and upgrade it, or we can deploy a new instance of automation. We can deploy ops for networks. We can deploy logs. We can basically go on and complete the other task. Yep. This is the same example, same scenario. The difference being here is this time we have ARIA operations. So you'll notice here, I'm going to go back and see here we started with vCenter and upgrading vCenter. But in this example, we have ARIA operations. So notice we start here by upgrading operations to 9.1. So we go out, download the pack file, upgrade operations to 9.1. And from here, it's pretty much the same path. The only difference is down here where I got these little question marks. Instead of deploying ops, it's going to skip that step because we already have ops upgraded. And so you'll see here how the upgrade path varies depending on whether I have ARIA operations and whether or not I'm going to have to manually upgrade it or whether I'm going to let the VCF installer upgrade it. All right, so let me do a quick time check. All right, let's look at some of the questions. So VCF ops includes NSX. We have no NSX running at this point. Okay, so VCF ops does not include NSX. VCF 9.1, VCF 9.x, or any VCF version is going to include NSX. So if you do not have NSX running in your environment and you use the VCF installer, it will basically understand whether or not NSX is deployed. If it's not deployed, it will deploy NSX, and you will be asked to provide information for the fully qualified host names as well as the cluster names, and you'll be required to provide that information. But yes, NSX is deployed. Now, with that said, if you are wanting to just say you don't want to go VCF, say I'm a vSphere 8.x environment, I want to go to vSphere 9.1. I'm not ready to go full VCF. I want to just stay vSphere. I don't want NSX yet. Okay, you can do that. That upgrade path, that is a supported upgrade path. You would need to deploy, you'd have the vSphere environment, which is your vCenter, your EXX host, configured in vSphere clusters. You would need to deploy operations and a license manager. And then basically go in and use those to relicense your environment. That's kind of a corner case, but I just kind of bring that up since you did ask that question. So if you have an existing ARIA Automation 8.18, when you import as part of the 9.1 deploy, can I use the same import appliance or will it deploy a new one automatically? No, when you do the import or the conversion, it's using the same existing appliance. So that's the whole idea here is you already have operations deployed. So we're going to basically upgrade it. And when we upgrade it to 9.1, it becomes VCF operations 9.1. And we're going to take that existing appliance and that's going to become the ARIA operations in your VCF fleet. So it's the same appliance. So if you're running standalone vSphere 8, can environment be upgraded by deploying VCF ops only to manage vCenter, or is the whole fleet automation? Okay, so I already answered that question. So yes, you can. The environment can be upgraded by just deploying VCF ops. The thing I would add is it's not just these VCF ops. You will need to also deploy a license server. There's documentation on this. If you go out and look for it, you'll find those steps. So so the short answer is you do not have to go full stack VCF. You can just upgrade your vSphere environment to 9.1 and get that licensed and up and running, and then look to the VCF full stack later down the road. That is definitely an option. What if you still have some old 7x hosts? How would it handle? Well, you'd need to get those 7.x hosts upgraded to 8. 8.x. So you'll need to pay attention to those versions. You'll want to be very careful and pay attention to CPU compatibility, hardware compatibility. A lot of times when you get on those 7X hosts, those tend to be older hosts, and they're not always on the ACL for the latest versions. Although we have done a lot of work recently to expand our support to extend support for older hardware versions with VCF 9.1 because of the challenges with hardware these days. But yeah, you will need to basically get your 7.x environment up to 8.x, 8.0 update 3 in order to as a starting point. So there's no way to come directly from 7.x into VCF 9. So there's no upgrade path from ARIA logs to the new instance must be deployed. Is there a method for retaining the 8x logs and moving it to the new 9? Yes. So I didn't cover this, but when you do upgrade, the logs is another one of those features that's moved into the VCF management services. As such, there's no upgrade path. There is some documentation that will show how to basically import some of the log configuration into the new version. So you basically stand up the new version, follow the documentation to basically copy over. So there is some things that will help you do that. I don't know in terms of how much data and how long and how far back you can go, but yes, there is a process or procedure you can follow to try and retain your logs configuration and some of that logs data for compliance and security reasons as you go forward and make that transition. So it says we are on ARIA operations. The operations mentioned is only for VCF ARIA operations. Okay, so a little bit on terminology here. So we used to have vRealize operations. It was renamed to ARIA operations, which was renamed to VCF operations. It's all the same operations. It's not different instantiations. It's just the same operations, just different versions. So if you are running if you're running operations version 8.18 or the 8.x version, we would typically refer to that as ARIA because that was the ARIA timeframe. And when you upgrade that to the 9.1 version, it's the same appliance. It just gets a new name called VCF operations. So yes, it is all the same. So whether I call it vRealize operations, ARIA operations, VCF operations, we're talking about the same component. What are the requirements to import workload vCenters into a greenfield? Okay, so when we're talking about import here, so I talked about the concept of convergence and taking an existing vCenter and converging that into a VCF instance. And remember, when we looked at the VCF instance, there was a concept of the management domain, and that management domain had additional components that would get deployed, like the SDDC manager, the VCF management services. Now, that's convergence. Now, once you set up that management domain, you can take other vCenter servers running in your environment, and you can import those as workload domains. Okay, that is done from VCF operations. Now, the requirements to import a vCenter server in as a workload domain are similar, but a little bit different than the requirements to converge. So when you import using VCF operations, it will be 8.0 update 3, some version, with or without NSX. And essentially, you want to make sure you meet those versions, but it's essentially 8.0 update 3. And the NSX version might be, I can't remember if this is the same or different, but essentially, when you import it, you go into operations and you bring that over. And if you have NSX, it will bring it over. If you don't have NSX, it will install NSX. Let's see. So do we need to first patch VCF 9.0.2 environment with okay, so when you're doing the upgrade, you can there's no need to go in and patch, like say you're running a VCF 9.0. You can go directly from VCF 9.0 to VCF 9.1. You don't need to go to VCF 9.0.1, then to VCF 9.0.2, then to VCF 9.1. We call that a skip level upgrade. You can skip the intermediate versions and go right to the latest version. So there's no requirement for you to go in and, if you're running 9.0.1, to go in and hurry up and patch that to 9.0.2 and then do the upgrade to 9.1. You can go directly from VCF 5.2 .x all the way up to VCF 9.1 directly without having to step through those interim releases. Okay. Question about vSAN. So again, vSAN is not required with Cloud Foundation. It is recommended. There are some benefits to it, particularly in the management domain, with its integration with our automation and the ability to kind of scale things up and down very quickly, but it is not required. For storage, the supported storage topologies are fiber channel, so VMFS on fiber channel, NFS, or vSAN. There is no requirement that you run vSAN. Is password rotation available again in VCF 9.1? So there is some. So when you say password rotation, we have to be very clear because within the SDDC manager, there was a specific feature referred to as password rotation, which was different than password updating. But within the SDDC, within VCF operations under manage, you'll be able to manage the passwords, and these are the admin accounts for things like vCenter, for NSX Manager, or for VCF operations. Those passwords will be visible, be there. You can go in and update the passwords. You can view the passwords, view details about their expiration, and you can kind of view and manage those passwords. However, there within VCF 9.0 and 9.1, there's no longer a rotate. So I can't go in and select a password and just say go rotate it. But I can go in and update it. So and you'll want to pay attention to those passwords as to make sure you don't have expired passwords or to manage those. And you can go into VCF operations and set password policies where you can set a consistent policy across all the components in terms of complexity, expiration, and things like that. Yeah, so it looks like Corey just kind of mentioning that going back even further when we had VCF, we had VC ops, went to VR ops, went to VCF operations again. So operations is operations is operations. It's all one project, just went through a lot of name changes. All right, so with this, looks like we got about a few minutes. Let me take the last few minutes here. And we went through this example. Now I do have other examples here where we could do the VCF upgrade path. This is going from VCF 5.2 to 9.1. I'm not going to go through these in detail just for the sake of time, but I just kind of show you that I do have these kind of mapped out. And when you have VCF, so if you are a VCF 5.2 shop, the big question you have to ask yourself is, have you deployed the ARIA suite? If you've deployed the ARIA suite, your upgrade path is going to be slightly different than if you have not deployed the ARIA suite. So here, if you have not deployed the ARIA suite, you'll see that you'll start by basically going in and deploying VCF operations 9.1 along with the cloud proxy. Okay, if you do have the ARIA suite, then you'll see you start by upgrading your existing operations up to 9.1 and then deploy or upgrade that proxy. So again, the path will vary depending on the components that are installed. And then this last example here just talks about the VCF 9.1. And this one is probably the easiest of the paths because VCF 9.1 is going to have all these components and you kind of just follow through. And so these paths are available. I do have additional information. If you're interested, if you want to go into more detail on a specific path, reach out to your TAM and have them get in touch with me and we can jump in and go through. I'm working on some demos and stuff that will kind of show this as well. And so with that, I think that's let me just kind of go through the key takeaways. And I'm going to go into a quick demo and just kind of show you what this will look like from a vSphere perspective, as I'm guessing that's probably the most common path. But the big thing to take away from our time together around upgrades is that your upgrade path is going to vary on your starting state. So if you're out there Googling, you're looking, you see what somebody else did, just keep in mind that your path might be slightly different because if he didn't upgrade something, maybe he didn't upgrade something that you need to upgrade something like vSphere, or maybe he had NSX and you didn't have NSX. So your upgrade path is going to vary based on your starting state. And when you do the upgrade, additional components will get deployed. So the footprint of your management domain is going to get bigger. Make sure you plan for that capacity. Make sure you plan for that additional space. And then in almost all cases, after you're done, you're going to need to relicense after because the new license server, and you're going to need to go through that process to relicense. All right, how are we doing on questions? If the environment doesn't have NSX but has vSphere plus ops, manual upgrade for both are required first. Okay, so let me go back. Let me go back to that one because that's a good question. So if you come back here, so the environment does not have NSX, but it does have ops. So if it doesn't have NSX, you would need to upgrade vCenter to 9.1, and you would need to upgrade ops to 9.1. So yes, you would need to upgrade both to 9.1, and then you would go in and use the VCF installer to converge. So yes, if you have an environment with ops but it does not have NSX, then you would need to upgrade both vCenter and ops, and then you'd basically use the VCF installer to complete that. All right, so let me go back and where's my find my I'm not sure why I got this. Okay, so here's my demo. And so let me go through and make sure I got the right demo. Pretty sure this is the one I need. All right, so this is, so I haven't really talked about time to deploy, but one thing that you will want to be aware of is it does take about 3 hours, a little bit over 3 hours to deploy a new VCF 9.1 greenfield instance. And if you're doing a Converge instance or an upgrade, the time it takes is still going to be very similar. It just really is going to depend on whether you choose simple deployment model, high availability deployment model, whether you can deploy, how long it takes, but it will take a fair bit of time. So as such, because it does take so long, it's very hard to do live demos. So these are recorded demos. So not trying to pull any wool over your eyes or trick you, but this is a recorded demo. But basically, it's going to give me the opportunity to kind of just demonstrate what we've been talking about. And I hope to get through this in about 10 minutes, and then we can wrap it up with questions. So here I got my environment. So this is, you'll notice I got my vCenter selected here. I am running 9.1. Now you'll notice here that I have not upgraded my ESX host. My ESX hosts are still 8.0. And I've got 4 ESX hosts in this environment. Okay, and then here I have my vCenter server, and I have a couple of Linux VMs sitting out here. Just I wanted to have something in the inventory. But things I want you to kind of pay attention to is the inventory. Notice right now all I have is a vCenter server, and I've got a 9.1 vCenter server and 8.0 ESX host, and then here's my vCenter appliance. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically take this environment and I'm going to upgrade it or converge it into a VCF 9.1 instance or a fleet. Because I don't have operations, I'll be deploying a new fleet. Okay. So I'm going to do this by using the VCF installer. Okay. Now, prior to this demo, I did upgrade my vCenter to 9.1. So I figure most of you probably know how to upgrade vCenter, and many of you are probably better at it than I am. So I didn't go in and show that. I skipped that just to help make the demo quick. But you'll notice here I've logged into the VCF installer. So here we logged in. This is the VCF installer, and you'll notice here the getting started. The first thing I had to do was go in and set up my depot. So here I have set up an online depot. And so basically I just went in and I registered my depot with the VCF Business Services Console, got my activation code, put that in. And when I did that, the binaries become available. Here's a list of all the binaries. You'll see they've all been downloaded. So I have my VCF installer. I'm registered with my software depot. I've downloaded the 9.1 binaries. So now I am ready to go ahead and do my deployment. So I'm going to use the deployment wizard. And so here we come into the deployment wizard. Notice at the top here, we got the introduction, we got the plan, we got the prepare, and we got the deploy. So that plan phase is where I talked about how it's going to give us some information about sizing recommendations and stuff. So kind of just watch this as we go through. Okay, so we got some introductory information here, just talking about the VCF operations, automation, the instance. So that kind of those concepts I was talking about around the VCF instance, the VCF fleet, and what's required. It's kind of covered here, so it takes time to read that. And then here you'll see is that question of, are we deploying a new fleet or are we adding a new VCF instance to an existing fleet? And then here's that advanced option for those deferred components. Here, we do not have an existing instance of operations, so we're going to be deploying a new fleet. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that option selected, go next. And then here's asking for my existing components. So I do not have an existing operations. So I'm going to leave that one, but I do have an existing vCenter, but this vCenter is not registered with NSX. So the only component I'm going to choose here is the vCenter server. I'm going to take that existing vCenter and bring that in. That's going to become the vCenter for my VCF instance. my management domain in my VCF instance. And just for sake of making the demo a little bit faster, I'm going to skip the automation appliance deployment here, as I will deploy that later as a day 2 operation. So basically, after I've converged it, got it stood up, I'll go into operations and add automation as afterwards. Now here, I'm going to get into my size options. You'll see here, this is high availability by default, and this is kind of telling you what the components that are affected and the sizes that are needed. So in this lab environment, I don't do high availability, I do simple, and you'll notice the size gets quite a bit smaller. Essentially, the difference is if I do high availability, it's going to do 3 nodes for the operations. It's going to do like, I think 6 or 7 nodes for the VCF management, 3 nodes for the VCF manager. But basically, when I choose simple, the footprint gets a little bit smaller, and that just fits better for my lab environment. And then here we go into network options. So in terms of network options, we can do some customization here. It's basically asking us, are we going to use the VCF management network? It's going to be the same as the VM management network, or are we going to use a separate VLAN? And so depending on how we answer this, it will determine what VLANs we need to provide as far as the installer. And then here's that review screen where it tells us, and here you'll see is a minimum of 2 hosts required based on the configuration that I have provided. Okay, so 2 hosts with a certain amount of CPU memory, and then no VLANs will be required because I'm basically bringing in existing vCenter, and those VLANs I already have VLAN for vMotion, VLAN for vSAN, so that's there. And then come down here, will basically give me guidance in terms of what fully qualified domain names and IPs. Notice down here the VCF management services, I need 4 fully qualified domain names and an IP range of 12 IP addresses. So you want to make sure you kind of spend time getting familiar with the prerequisites and understand this. All right, so now I move into the prepare phase. And so here I get into my general information. So this is where I'm going to give it a name for my instance, a name for my management domain. And at this point, you can see I'm just basically going through following the wizard. There's the 6 steps over here and providing the input. Now this screen is likely going to be new to many of you. So obviously VCF operations, because I don't have an existing operations, I'm going to be deploying one. And then the cloud proxy again is a required component. So so those 2 will be there. And then the license server is also a new component introduced with 9.1. And then down here's my VCF management services. So remember when we were at the plan tab, I mentioned it's going to require 4 fully qualified domain names. Here we see those. The VSP is kind of short for VCF Services Platform. And that's basically the VCF Services runtime. The identity broker, this replaces the VIDM, and that will be deployed. And again, these are all going to run inside that VCF management services. And then I have my fleet, my instance. And so basically, I'm going to provide all these. Now you'll notice again here, nowhere is it asking me for passwords because it's going to auto generate those passwords. Okay. And then here, because I have an existing vCenter server, I'm going to go ahead and provide those existing vCenter server credentials, the admin and root password. I'll go out and do a quick connect, make sure I got the right fingerprints, thumbprints, and then here I'll go in and say, okay, it basically evaluates my vCenter and come back and said, hey, you're good to go. However, it's saying you're a little undersized here. We recommend you have a little bit extra capacity for things like maintenance mode, things like that. This is a lab environment. I know I'm undersized, so I'm going to ignore this warning. In a production environment, I definitely would want to address that. Okay, and so just basically saying, hey, we gave you a warning. I say, yeah, I seen it. I'm still going to ignore it. Okay, now this is where I require that range of 12 IP addresses. And this is for the VCF management services. So here, a minimum of 12, maximum of 30. If you have the option, I would just do 30. And basically, these are the IP addresses that we're going to assign to the VCF management services, which is essentially a Kubernetes cluster under the covers. And it's going to self-manage these IP addresses. So we just need to give it a range of IPs. And the reason for the number is to support future scale and growth. As you grow things up, as you do upgrades, it will kind of pull from this range of IP address and use these IP addresses. So that way, when you're doing operations inside SDC Manager or inside VCF operations, you don't have to keep going out and asking for IP addresses or assigning them because it's got this pool of IP addresses that it's available to it that it will use internally. Okay, and because I do not have NSX, it's going to deploy a new NSX. Now here, because I chose the simple deployment model, I only have to deploy one NSX appliance as opposed to three if I chose the high availability. And then it's asking me some information about the NSX overlay networking and whether I want to basically double that up with my ESX management. So that's kind of gets into your whether or not you're going to configure your TEPs separate or not. And then the STC manager. Now here, the STC manager, this is the same appliance that we're using for the VCF installer. Now, if the VCF installer, if I was to deploy the VCF installer on this vSphere cluster, it would basically take the existing VCF installer and just convert it to the STC manager. But because my VCF installer is running outside, it will actually deploy another instance of this. But that is the same OVA, but this will have run in STC manager mode as opposed to installer mode. And I'm going to go ahead and do this. Now here we get to the review screen. And here you can see I have a summary of the configurations I provided. And here's where you see I can also view this in JSON, and I can also save this as a JSON template. So again, this JSON template's where you can save this and make some of those customizations. And if you're doing repeated installs, make it easier because you don't have to walk through the wizard each time. Okay. Then we'll go ahead and do a validation and get ready for deployment. Now this validation will take a few minutes. In my labs, it seems like it takes about 10 to 15 minutes. And you want to pay attention to the status. Now, I do have some warnings here. This demo was created prior to the GA, and as such, there are some issues with compatibility checks and things that I are kind of tied to my lab environment, the fact that this is pre-GA. And so I can just ignore those. But the thing is if you have any warnings, you do have the option to acknowledge and proceed. If you have any errors, then you will not be able to proceed. You will have to go back and fix those errors. Now I can go in and I can, at this point, I can save this. I can close this and save this. I can go and address any errors, come back, and then rerun the validation as often as I need to in order to make sure I have a good, successful validation. Okay, so here we're going to go ahead and acknowledge this, and we'll click deploy. Okay, so now it's going to go out and it's basically going to deploy. And this is where that 3 hours comes in. It will take about 3 hours to deploy this. You'll see it starts by deploying the STC manager. I can come out here to the vCenter server and I can kind of watch this as this happens. Although I would definitely recommend that while this is going on, you don't do any changes. Don't go in and start making changes inside STC manager, inside the vCenter server. Just kind of set back. You can monitor its progress, keep track of it, but just read-only mode, view-only mode. Don't go in and start making changes because the VCF installer is going to be in there making changes as well, and you don't want to step on that or cause a conflict. If anything, okay, so anyways, let's go ahead and jump forward to the end here. As it does deployment, you'll have to log out, log in, because it does take a fair bit of time. But here you'll see we have completed the deployment. And so now I go in here and I see the green banner here telling me it deployed successfully. I can go in and view details. And here I can go in and see essentially the history of what took place. So I deployed the STC manager. It took that existing vCenter server and converted it into a VCF instance. It deployed and configured NSX. It deployed and configured the management services platform. And then it deployed and configured the operations appliance and then configured the services on top of the management services platform. Okay, so basically this whole process, I didn't record it for this one, but again, this will take 2 to 3 hours. It depends on your hardware. This is a nested environment, so it's probably a little bit slower than what you would see on physical servers. It depends on your storage, and there's a lot of factors, how long it takes to deploy OVAs and stuff that will influence this time. But you'll see here, now that I'm done, so the first thing I'll need to do is review my passwords. So here's the list of passwords. You can save these as a JSON, comma separated values. I'm going to go to operations. I'm going to copy that admin password so I can log into the VCF operations UI. Log in with admin and that password. And then here I would go in, and this is where I'd go in to set up my VCF SSO and set up my authentication so people can log in with their credentials and things like that. But here you'll see in the inventory, I now have that VCF instance as registered as my VCF management domain. That vSphere instance is now my management domain. It's fully configured. If I come down here and go into the integrations, we can see that it's registered as Cloud Foundation account and that the management domain, we're collecting metrics across the board. Okay, and then I come over here to the build tab, the software depot. It will carry the software depot configuration from the VCF installer. So you'll see it's already connected. You'll want to check this. I have found that sometimes I need to go in and reconnect the depot after the install is done. I come in here to Lifecycle. Here's my VCF management services. These are not the actual names. Like I say, this is an early version. These are the pre-GA names. So the names are a little bit more user friendly. But this VSP, this is my VCF services platform that's deployed. If we come out here to my vCenter server, you'll notice the inventory looks quite a bit different than when we started. Before we had a single vCenter server, but now we got a resource pool. We have a license server, an NSX manager, operations with an operations proxy, the SDDC manager. Here's our vCenter server. And then we have these VSP VMs. This is the VCF services runtime. And so these, you'll see these components were almost all of these, except for the vCenter, were added as part of this new deployment. And so at this point, I now would go in and if I come back here, remember my vCenter server is running 9.1, but my hosts are still running 8.0. So at this point, I would come back in here under and into the operations, and I would go through and upgrade my ESX host. All right, so with that, let's jump back over to the slides. I think we've got through all the slides. Yeah, so let's okay, so anyway, let's look at the last few questions and we can wrap up here. Do you still pick a new fleet if you have an old operations and existing vCenter that were manually upgraded to 9? Yes. So you would basically pick new fleet. And when you ask for existing components, you would specify, you would click, I have an existing operations, and you would specify that 9.1 instance of operations that you upgraded. Okay. If I upgrade vCenter and ops to 9.1 manually, do I still have 30-day license? With the new license appliance, or is there another way? So after you upgrade vCenter and ops, you will have 90 days, and that you will need to basically go in and complete your license registration and get your license file within that 90 days. There's no way to extend that, so it's very important. And this is part of the reason why you'll notice, like in this slide here, we always start with ops. We always make sure you have a version of ops, because we realize once you do this upgrade, you're going to need to relicense. So we want to make sure you have ops up and running. But it's a 90-day window is the time you have from the time you complete the upgrade until you need to get it relicensed. What about NSX Federation, where you have local NSX managers and global on top of those? So if you go to the documentation, if you have NSX Federation, there is a manual step that will be required to go in and manually upgrade the global managers, in conjunction with doing the upgrade process. So if you have an existing NSX, you will go in, upgrade your global managers, and then go in and upgrade your local managers. And the timing of that, the sequencing of that is covered in the documentation. But there is an important you have to consider that, because it is important that you upgrade those global managers in the right order. And so with that, I think that brings us pretty much to the end. Thanks for the questions. Lots of good questions. You guys have definitely put a lot of thought into this, and hopefully you found this, again, helpful, beneficial, and you now have at least a good start on what is involved with going from where you're at to VCF 9 and what your experience might look like. And again, if you have any other questions or follow-up, or if you want to go through some of those use cases we didn't get into in detail, reach out to your TAM, have them reach out to me, see if we can schedule a time. I'm happy to jump on and go through this in more detail if needed.
Yeah, definitely. Kyle, thanks so much for presenting on this topic. This is probably more of a personal note, but these upgrade paths that you put together, I've seen them for 9 and for 9.1. Extremely helpful. It looked like there were a lot of questions going back to these, workflows that you have here. I think it's a great resource, and to everyone to all the participants, if you follow up with your TAM, we can take a look at those and step through it for sure. And Kyle, thanks for making yourself available
Sure.
to me as well. So again, really great content today, and thanks for diving into this. For everyone, also for the participants on the call, if we didn't get to your question, reach out to your TAM. We'll follow up. And just as a reminder, today's session was recorded. Your TAM will also make that recording link available to you. And at the end of this session, please take a moment to fill out the 2-question survey that we mentioned at the beginning of this. We truly appreciate your feedback. Please join us next month on July 16th, where we will continue this 9.1 series with a practitioner's look at vSphere 9.1 features. We look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you for joining us. Take care.
All right, thank you.